What is the creepiest sound you have ever heard? Story one, I've worked psych for 20 years. In my first job, we had an area blocked off from the rest of the unit called the short hall. It was locked behind a heavy door and used to condone off violent or unmanageable clients. It had 3 rooms and a restroom, but nothing else really. I always felt bad for clients back there, but there was a second, smaller door which we never used. It was right beside the nurse's station where we did paperwork. There was a panel of supposedly unbreakable glass in the door, which let us see and talk to clients in the short hall. The state hospital was shut down, and an old school client was sent home. He was sent to us a week later after he broke into an elderly man's house and tried to beat the man to death with a brick. The client was extremely sick, unpredictable, and violent. I remember sitting at the nurse's station one shift, with him standing in the short hall, pressing his cheek against the window. He said, "You can take advantage of me if you want. I won't try to stop you." To which I replied, "I don't want anyone hurting anybody." He then proceeded to punch the window repeatedly while yelling. We had to go in and sedate him. Thank Christ he let us give him the shots, as it was just me and 2 110-pound women. Despite the shots, he would just start punching the glass and screaming. 12 hours later, he was beating his head against the window when I clocked out. The creepiest sound I ever heard was a man hitting his head against Gorilla Glass, who clearly didn't have anything resembling hesitation and would have killed me in a second for no reason without a dash of remorse. The worst part was sitting there for hours listening to it a foot away as I tried to play it cool for my subordinates and the other clients. Story 2. Sitting in my basement office one night years ago, headphones on, wife and 2-year-old son sleeping upstairs. I hear a blood-curdling scream right behind me. I physically shook and felt my heart sink into my chest. I'm almost too terrified to turn around and see the demon murderer behind me. Turns out my son was so excited he found his daddy in the middle of the night, he screamed with excitement. I'm still traumatized to this day. Story 3. Commented about this before on Reddit, but when my husband and I first moved into our new house, we were chilling and watching TV one afternoon when we suddenly heard a single pure note of music, like someone had pressed the key of a piano, except we have no piano, and it came from our dining kitchen area. We immediately paused the TV and looked at each other like, W beef was that? Proceeded to spend the next half hour looking like crazy people, walking around the house, tapping everything trying to recreate that sound. Going so far as to ask the friend who used to live there if he'd ever heard anything like that while living there. No clue what caused it, and it gives me goosebumps still when I think about it, and it's been almost 5 years. Story 4. I stayed with my aunt one summer, and we had both just gotten in bed when I heard heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. Her house had alarms, and we didn't hear a door open. They were slow and heavy. She was in the room down the hall, and I yelled out to her to lock her door. The footsteps stopped, and that was the last time I heard them. I waited about 30 minutes. I was 9, 10, and neither of us owned a cell phone, before slowly making my way to her room. She had heard them as well, and we waited a bit longer, but didn't hear anything else. She had me wait by the phone while she went downstairs, but absolutely nothing was out of order. The doors were locked, and the alarm was active. We stayed up a bit longer and eventually went back to bed. It's still one of the scariest moments of my life because I can't explain what happened. I don't believe in ghosts, but I don't know what else it could be. There's a very distinct sound that comes from the stairs when someone is walking up and down them, and we both heard it. Story 4. My son's voice during his first seizure. He screamed in terror, but then it changed, and it wasn't his voice anymore. I know now why a lot of neurological stuff could be confused with possession. It was an awful sound, and much deeper than his voice. And he looked so wrong. He was only a year and a half old. He rarely slept more than 2 hours at a time at night. I knew his voice. That wasn't his voice. I got more used to the seizures, but that noise, it wasn't the same as his cry just before or just after, always chilled me. I don't think of it as a sound he was doing, so much as just the sound of something going wrong inside him. That's the creepiest sound. Not the saddest, but the creepiest. But worse is sounds that should be there and aren't, like your kid breathing. That always messed me up even when I was able to make the lack of sound stop. Then I couldn't. Story 4. Was home alone and taking a dump one day when I heard my front door open and close. I didn't think anyone in my family would be coming back at this time, so I opened the bathroom door just a tad and shouted, "Hello," into the hallway. No response. My 2 cats were strangely sitting politely right in front of the bathroom door. So I opened it more and listened closely to see if I could hear any movement coming from the front door. It's impossible to see it from the bathroom. Nothing, not a sound. Right when I convinced myself that I had imagined hearing the sound of my front door opening and closing, the loudest gasping sound I've ever heard came from that direction. Not only that, but my cats hear it too. They both whip their heads to look towards the front door and go wide-eyed. They then quickly run the opposite way. I slammed the bathroom door closed. I can't remember how long I stayed there, but nothing else happened after that. It's so hard trying to tell this story to people because I always try to reproduce the gasp, but there's just no way. What I heard has to be at least 10 times louder than the loudest gasp I'm able to produce. Story 5. I once was woken up in the middle of the night, around 25 years ago, by the sound of a horrible high-pitched screaming sound coming from inside my room. Was convinced I was having some sort of nightmare. But as the fog of sleep slowly lifted, it dawned on me that the horror of the situation was real. Didn't have a bedside lamp at the time, so I had to muster the courage to get out of my bed and switch on the light to see what horrific monster was lurking in the dark. My cat had caught a frog and was torturing it on my bedroom floor. That day, I learned that frogs scream. Literally one of the most harrowing experiences of my life. Story 6. As a missionary on the East Coast, my companion woke me up in the middle of the night one night, telling me he'd heard a blood-curdling scream from the upstairs apartment above us. We didn't say anything for a while, trying to see if we could hear it again, to no avail. A couple months later, my companion sat me down and told me he'd heard the scream many more times, and every time he'd hear it, he'd write about it in his journal. Well, he showed me each journal entry where the scream was recorded, and I kid you not, it was every 9 days, like clockwork since he first heard it. About a month later, I woke up in the middle of the night to turn the thermostat down. As I was falling back asleep, I heard the most unnatural animal shriek that lasted about 5 seconds before cutting off violently. My whole body froze up and I couldn't get myself to calm down. Across the room from his bed, my companion said, "You heard it too?" When those upstairs neighbors moved out a few weeks later, my companion and I never heard the screams again. Story 7. The scariest thing I ever heard wasn't a noise. I don't know how to describe this, and maybe some of you aren't going to believe or understand what I mean, but I promise this was a real phenomenon that I experienced. I moved to Taiwan in October of 2022 and had the first earthquake experience of my life. This was a small one, and nothing very serious. First, I didn't realize what was happening. I thought maybe I was just dizzy. I was sitting at my desk in my apartment, and everything started swaying left to right. It took me a good 5 seconds to comprehend that it was a minor earthquake. The shaking and swaying didn't scare me at all. What terrified me to my core was the silent scream being directly transmitted into my brain. I could hear the earth telepathically shouting at me, "Danger, danger, danger!" I can only assume that it activated some primal sense from a prehistoric time. The way prey animals know things are coming ahead of time. I really felt this. Imagine a giant with his mouth open, but no sound coming out, and yet his immense and horrifying scream is still heard in your mind. Really freaked me out. Story 8 was home alone, and a violent storm came out of nowhere. Suddenly, the kitchen light dimmed, and the wind sounded like an old train whistle. I remembered this possibly being the sound of an oncoming tornado. I ran into our small bathroom under the stairs, shut the door, and crouched down into a corner wall, covering my head with my arms. It passed almost as quickly as it came up. Looked outside, and trees were literally snapped and ripped from the ground at my neighbors' houses. Heard later that a tornado had passed in my area less than a mile away, causing a lot of damage to rooftops and downing many trees and tree limbs. Story 9. Had to run 3 miles, but I didn't want to run 1.5 miles one way and back, so I had my brother drop me off 3 miles away from home. I guess I never thought about it, but being in the middle of the woods at night, everything is absolutely pitch black. He asked me if I was sure, and while I was a bit nervous, but I said yeah, he drove off. It was completely pitch black, but I was only 3 miles away. So I shook it off not even 20 seconds later. I heard the loudest, most blood-curdling scream I've ever heard come from the woods. I felt the adrenaline rush me immediately and thought I was in danger. It sounded like a woman. It was so loud, I thought it was closer than it was. I couldn't see anything, so I was in a panic. I didn't know if I should turn my phone flashlight on or not. The moment I decided to run, I still remember the run because I was running what to me was so fast. I didn't even feel tired or anything. The adrenaline pushed me. I ran what felt like a marathon. But according to my watch, it was only a mile. When I got to a point where my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I called my brother to come get me, and I explained what happened. When he got to me, we had a debate for like 30 minutes to see if we should go check it out. We did, and we went to where the noise came from. We couldn't see anything from the edge of the woods, so we decided to leave. On Apple Maps and Google Maps, when you zoom into that area, you see a cabin in the directions the scream came from. And I always wondered if they're linked. To this day, I still want to go check it out, but I think it's private property. Story 10. Sesame Street put out a set of light-activated dolls. Big Bird said, "Peekaboo," whenever it went from light to dark. After about the 10th time of Big Bird giving me a stroke when I went to check on my daughter, I threw him in the basement. About 6 months later, I have to go in the creepy-ass basement at night to get something. I pull the cord on the old-fashioned hanging light bulb, and I hear peekaboo. all slow and strangely because the batteries are dying. I ran out a side door and halfway down a hill before I realized I'd abandoned my wife and daughter to an axe murderer. By that point, I finally remembered what it was. I went in and kicked the crap out of Big Bird to get my manhood back. To make it worse, my wife had seen me running down the hill and wouldn't quit until I told her why. Let's just say she was disappointed in me. Story 11. An ex-girlfriend was sleeping downstairs in my shared house after a party. She'd been a bit weird all night, and when I went upstairs, intuition tingling, moved my writing desk in front of my room door. My ex was the only person downstairs after the party was over. This is significant. Sure enough, just after I dozed off, I was awoken by a thump as my room door was torn. Someone had waited until they thought I was asleep and partially opened it, and it had banged against my writing desk. That wasn't the creepiest part. The creepiest part was when I called out, alarmed, asking my ex if she was there. She didn't reply, but I clearly heard her slow footsteps going back down our creaking staircase as she tried to pretend she'd never been there and that it wasn't her. Story 12, Sky Trumpet. So many people call this fake, but I have experience with it. Granted, not a lot, but enough to where it was startling. So I was sitting at home, just playing some game, when I thought I heard my dad calling me. It was initially a different thought because my dad had told me he was going to Home Depot. So I took my headphones off and walked to where I thought I heard his voice, front door, and opened it. Then, as soon as the door fully opens, I hear the trumpets. It kind of just sounded like a low groan. It was a frightening thought. I think I was around 10 when it happened, so it was probably just scarier then than it would be now. Story 13. I'm from Philadelphia and was never into hunting or camping. I joined the military at 18 and was sent to the desert outside El Paso. One night I was on guard duty all by myself. It was pitch black and I couldn't see anything but thousands of stars. As I was admiring the stars, a pack of coyotes silently snuck up behind me. Then, all at once, they began to bay and howl to each other. They were so close to me on all sides, but I couldn't see them at all. I could just hear the yipes, howls, random localizations surrounding me. As a city boy, I was entirely unprepared. I white-knuckler it all night long. It was the most fear I had ever felt. As my years in the military progressed, I learned that coyotes are loud and harmless, but holy crap, IT was the stuff of nightmares for 18-year-old me. Story 14. Possible skinwalker. For about a week, there was this kitten that kept mewling around my ex's backyard. He lived in a desert climate, so there was no plant life anywhere near his backyard, save for a tree just past the fence. We looked up and down that yard for days and never found the kitten. It would only meow at night. Then, one night, I was outside alone when I heard the kitten again. Except this time, it got deeper and deeper with each cry until it sounded less like a newborn cat and more like a human doing a really bad impression of a cat. It was the creepiest sound I've heard to this day, straight out of a horror movie. It's the only time in my life I've felt a primal fear, like something was hunting me. Something in my gut told me to get back inside, and now I've been around bears, I've seen wolves. I walked next to my mother moose. I know nature and I know when to respect it. Never, not once ever has an animal made me feel as scared as that thing did that night. I hope I never hear it again, so long as I live. Story 15. So a couple of years ago, I was browsing Reddit at about 1 a.m. when I heard this screeching sound, genuinely something out of a horror film. Check the house. Nope, it's outside. Screeching continues. It's some kind of injured animal, but what? Fox? Owl? Previously unknown Scottish Yeti? No idea. Nothing in my garden. It's next door. I'm amazed nobody else can hear this. It's loud and creepy as hell. I'm hoping the neighbor hears and comes out to help me. So I get the head torch out and head into the next door's garden, praying I don't get attacked by whatever the hell this is. It's a hedgehog. A hedgehog caught in the wee boy's football net. And it's not the one screaming. The one screaming stood beside it, desperately trying to get help. Screamer runs away in fear, and I now have a hedgehog problem. Run back to the house, grab scissors, cut the net open to let the wee guy out, realize I don't have anything to catch him in. Fine. Top off. Catch him in that. I'm now standing in the next door's garden in jammy bottoms and a bra at 1 a.m., holding a pair of scissors and a terrified hedgehog. I'm now hoping the neighbor doesn't come out to see this. Hedgehog wriggles out of top, runs away covered in bits of net. I went over the next day, explained why the football net was cut, and offered to pay to replace it, and they were lovely about it. But yeah, that sound. I never dreamed a hedgehog could make that noise, and I hope I never hear it again. Story 16. I was in a castle, in the middle of nowhere at night, reading creepy books by headlamp. The book was House of Leaves, and right as spooky stuff goes down. In the book, it references a tremendous noise. Right then, I heard a loud "boing," like in the trailer of a Christopher Nolan movie. It shook the ground. I got up to go look outside, and before I got to the front, felt it again. My heart was racing, but I didn't see anything. And although it was sunset, I could still see for miles in every direction thanks to being on the top of a large hill. Nothing. I have no idea what it was. I had spent a lot of time at that location and never heard it again, but the way it coincided with the book made it creepier than otherwise. Story 17. Tough one, beware. The sound of my mother finding our cat in the dryer after she had it running for an hour. He went in there because it was warm, and he had hidden himself in the blankets. She didn't see him when she closed the door and started it. By the time an hour had gone by, he was still alive, but severely brain damaged. He was put down for mercy. She had heard thumping while the dryer started, but confused the sound with some boots or heavy wet clothing that was also in there. Then she went upstairs and closed the door. The sound her voice made when she found him was horrific. It was the most anguished, high-pitched shriek I've ever heard. To this day, I can still hear it. It was otherworldly and gut-wrenching and awful. It was inhuman. And since then, I've not heard anyone make such a sound again. That was a horrible day. Story 18. My parents purchased some rural property in the middle of nowhere in the woods. I was always hesitant to stay there alone because there had been a murder across the street years prior and just a general feeling of unease. One night I was sitting on the back porch and it was really windy, and the sound of a sisal rope and chain whipping around in the trees really wiggled me out. I got my flashlight and could see them swaying on the branches tucked into the trees. It sounded like that scene in Conjuring, where she hears the witch hanging behind her mixed with chains. Weird, since there was no weight on the rope. The next day I went over there, and under the leaves, a partially burned flannel and old glass liquor bottle. Anyway, there were a lot of racist hate crimes in this part of the country back in the day, and I turned my stomach. Maybe someone used it for a cleaning game. I don't know. But it was a creepy sound. No likey. Story 19. A few weeks ago, I was in bed, in the middle of the night, half awake / half asleep, and I was listening to the sound of an owl, or something like an owl, only slower and deeper. In my half-awake state, it felt soothing, but then I became sharply aware that I was awake, alone in my apartment in the city, and there are no owls here. I completely woke up and opened my eyes. It was pitch dark. At first there was silence, and I thought it was just a dream, but then I heard it again in the corner of my room. My blood ran cold, and I was too afraid to move and turn on my lamp, but I eventually did, and there was nothing. I can't explain it. Story 20 would be the sound of the floorboards creaking at my parents' house. I was about 17 or so, and my parents used to forget to lock the doors at night. The front door was deadlocked, but the back door, you had to lock it. So I was half asleep about midnight and heard what sounded like someone walking in the house, with the floorboards creaking. No one was supposed to be awake, and they would make more noise if it was someone in the house. All the lights were off, and my bedroom door was closed. I loudly got out of bed and turned the light on, then waited. I waited for probably a minute, but didn't hear anything else. So I opened my door to the pitch-black hallway and turned on the light. I heard and saw nothing. I went to the back door. It was unlocked, but closed, so I locked it, and this is where it gets scary. I went to the front door, and it was wide open. Because of the front yard being full of foliage, I couldn't see anything, since not even moonlight could get through. The person could have been standing 2 meters, 6 feet away. The whole thing was pitch black. I turned on the light on the porch, but it was an old fluorescent one, which took ages to heat up and get to any useful amount of light, so it was useless anyway. I closed the door and checked around the rest of the house, but never saw or heard anything more that night. After that night, I was extra vigilant to check the back door before going to bed.